I enjoyed following this week's discussions, and this presentation synthesizes several themes that I gleaned from your Module 2 discussions and from the readings on the experiences of women in the academy. The first theme that I gleaned was on work-life balance. Most of the discussion on work-life balance seemed to touch upon the topic of balancing multiple roles in addition to navigating graduate school. Black feminist epistemology recognizes that our own individual standpoints are experienced through context, and that when we speak from our subjectivities, we must also think of them as being situated within context. This relates to you sharing your own stories, which was actually speaking from your own subjectivities in the discussion post. But I also want to get you thinking about context too. It is important in recognizing the context that's surrounding your identities and how this may shape and influence how you make meaning of and experience the world, and you interpret others' experiences. The second theme was, which I call identity as experienced through context. This seemed to me to be an instructive discussion that worked to illustrate the complex nature of identities, like being a graduate student, an employee, an online learner, a parent, a spouse, a partner, and then also it implicit the skill and flexibility that one must use to navigate multiple social contexts. I also appreciated those of you who shared your very personal biographies and related them to the readings. That was very courageous and commendable, and this is also another example of standpoints and speaking from your own subjectivities. The last theme was mentorship. This concept is particularly important in this work because for marginalized identities navigating the academic context, it's important that we not only in scholarship illuminate the struggles, but also the strategies that individuals develop, such as finding a mentor to overcome them. All of these themes are important in understanding the context of the academy, which you read last week through the lenses of various authors, and it's also an assumption of feminist research that the academy is androcentric, that is, male-centered. We know this because of the historical context surrounding academia, one that has historically excluded and continues to marginalize women and minorities in higher education, which has been evidenced in the readings. But also, and I want to reiterate here, that it's important to interrogate context. We can get closer to understanding the lived experiences of human beings when we understand the context that surrounds them. That's why last week's readings focused on the context of in which the academy is situated. Epistemological standpoints help us see these contextual factors that shape and influence the way we are perceived and the way we perceive ourselves. So this goes back to one of the major tenets of Black feminist epistemology that recognizes that our own subjectivities are formed within context, and we experience our own identities through context. Myth of the work-life balance. I want to hone in on this topic because it was a salient topic in a lot of the discussion posts, and it's also a salient concept that emerges in my own research. Feminist discourses surrounding this topic often challenge this as an ideology and also being grounded in gender-based assumptions. Generally, when we have a conversation about women's lives outside of the domestic sphere in relation to work, we find that the work-life balance concept becomes an iterative thread in discussions around women's work. One assumption is surrounding gender divisions of labor, actually, where men's work was traditionally seen as being performed outside of the home and women's work was excluded to the domestic sphere. The function of caregiving was then viewed as a domestic task, and thus women in society become society's dominant caregivers, being responsible for taking care of children, the sick, and the elderly. Women's role in the workplace has largely shifted in relation to industrialization, but the feminist movement often gets attributed to opening up space in the workplace for women. While this is partly so, women's roles as dominant caregivers has not changed, and hence the development of the superwoman myth. This was a reconciliation of women's increased representation in the workforce, was also attached to economic development in society, whereas the superwoman myth claimed that women could do it all. They could have careers, maintain the home, all while wearing a stylish pair of shoes. Black feminist Patricia Hill Collins argued that while these social discourses based on generalized assumptions about women's roles in society are harmful to all women. They're particularly harmful to black women, especially because they were excluded. Black women's experiences in the workforce in terms of subordination, domination, and discrimination become largely overlooked when we talk about women's roles and women's work. In relation to what we've been reading and looking at the complex nature of identities, we can see that the contextual realities for women with multiple and intersecting identities, their experiences are shaped in a very much different way. Another assumption is this good mother, bad mother dichotomy. I think some of you may have touched upon this in the post implicitly. This comes up in my research a lot. Feminist discourse calls the good mother, bad mother dichotomy as an ideology that is attached to gender based assumptions. It's important that we look at how it insidiously works its way into social discourse around women's work and women wanting it all. Women who worked outside the home through this lens, this good mother, bad mother dichotomy, were charged with being bad mothers and putting their own ambitious pursuits above the needs of children. Finally, the myth of the work-life balance also suggests that there is a balance to be struck and that success in achieving this balance is a product of women's individual abilities. Women often internalize this and then speak about not being able to keep up. This is a part of a gendered social discourse that covertly functions to penalize women for pursuing roles outside of their gender relational roles as spouses and caregivers. I thought this would be a good space to share my research, particularly because we just finished up reading about the experiences of women within the academy, and also the piece that we read on the experiences of female graduate students and this notion of work life balance. My research particularly looks at academic motherhood among graduate students in terms of female identity development. And what I found through my research or through the discourses of graduate student mothers from various identity intersections was this commonality in experience and this perceived kind of struggle to maintain some kind of balance in how the women work to reconcile this feeling of not maintaining or achieving some sort of balance. And so, what I actually argue in terms of identity development, that the strategies that these women articulated or that they created to be able to navigate competing contexts of motherhood and academic work actually facilitated cognitive development. And so a lot of the women talk to me about strategies that they created so that they feel like they're able to balance or maintain both. While this was a particularly significant finding, and the way that I've framed this in terms of identity development is completely nuanced. I also still did pay attention to how social discourses are internalized. So, for a lot of the women, the strategies that they created were in response to social discourses around motherhood, about what it means to be a good mother, or what social discourse frames as being a good mother, and what social discourse frames as being a bad mother. And so a lot of the strategies that I found within the discourses of these mothers actually confirmed some of these ideologies. And I think that this is also really important, and why I share this here when we talk about how identity is shaped, formed, and made meaning of and experienced through context. And so while the women talked to me about the strategies that they created to be able to navigate the academy, it was academy itself that kind of created this dialectic in which they were able to form this response. And so the women were from different identity positions, and I also looked at discourses of race and class as well. And for this slide, questions to keep the pot stirring, so to speak. I'd like to ask of you, what kinds of social discourses are at play in these texts? We already know that gender Gender-based ideologies and assumptions are one of them, but what are some other social discourses do you see? I'd also like us to be critical of context. What is it about the nature of the academy that marginalizes some identities over others? And I also urge us to be critically reflexive in our responses. How does your sexual, race, and class identities relate to your gender identity? Think about in which context is your power constrained, limited, or in which context do you feel empowered? In other words, I'd like us to look at our privileges that are attached to identities and the context that either constrain or limit those or empower us. Lastly, the next section of text illustrates identity as context. I'd like us to pay attention to how identities can form the context of our lived realities. So the first section of the text, we looked at the actual context of academia. The second section, we looked at experience through context. This section, we're looking at identity as the context. So I'd like us to think about what that means, identity as context. And again, just pay attention to how identities are formed in the context of our lived realities.